It was hard for me to evaluate this one. It was hard for me to confidently rank this one simply because it is posthumous, given Freddie's passing in 1991. And while I did mention earlier in this video that I really wasn't going to let context sway me too much one way or the other, and I'm still going to try my best not to, it's hard for me to ignore that while it was made with love, while the rest of the band did put their hearts and souls into it to honor Freddie, as opposed to some record label just spitting out something to make money on someone's death, I acknowledge that that is very sweet and that it is an album to be taken seriously. It's just hard for me to get past that Freddie wasn't around to sign off on certain decisions, and that also a lot of the vocals were taken from random points in time. Like one of them was from the early 80s, one of them was from the mid 80s. So for me, that just makes it hard to stack it against the rest and fairly evaluate it. But again, I'm going to try to push the context aside and just talk about the album itself. I personally like it, and what I like most about it perhaps is that it has a fair amount of ballads. Now, rock bands, especially rock bands with Roger Taylor and Brian May, characters like that, are a bit standoffish to ballads. You know, most of their albums will have a couple, maybe three. This one kind of felt like half and half. So I'm glad that they weren't too skittish about that, because in my opinion, by the late 70s even, Queen was so much more than just a rock band. They had evolved as creators and artists to be kind of hard to assess, hard to categorize. So I'm glad, even if it took some kind of tribute album, I'm glad that it was refreshing in the sense of it not being just trying to be rock and roll all the time, and that they slowed it down to really honor Freddie Mercury. And in my opinion, there are quite a few standouts from this album. Made in Heaven, Let Me Live, Too Much Love Will Kill You, and my personal favorite being Heaven for Everyone. Aside from all that, a lot of the songs that weren't necessarily standouts still sound very nice, in large part due to it being from 1995. And yes, 90s music can also be super dated, but really not in the way that 80s music can. So the ones that weren't amazing were still very pleasant to listen to. They didn't really sound too much like each other, which is something that I found was very prevalent on the prior albums leading up to this one. So yeah, this is where I rank it. I don't mean to be insulting to anybody who puts it on a bit of a pedestal because it's posthumous, because it's in tribute to Freddie, but again, I'm just kind of weighing the album for what it is. Up next, we have The Game from 1980, and this is Queen entering the 80s. However, the reason I feel it is a stronger album than any of the ones I've mentioned is because it is coming off the heels of the 70s, where, in my opinion, they've really excelled. Overall, I like The Game, certainly more than any of the prior albums I've mentioned. Out of the 10 tracks, a good 4 of them became really big hits, and I'm not someone who believes that good hits equals a good album, but what that tells you at least is that they were fairly consistent in making songs that people could get into, songs that stood out, and songs that really showcased what they were capable of, which in my opinion is something that kind of waned, at least consistently, as the 80s progressed. On this album, you have some of the most iconic tracks of Queen's entire catalog of music, one of which being Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which is their little rockabilly, kind of Elvis Presley-inspired hit that, in my opinion, sounded unlike anything they've done before, which I really like in terms of them evolving and never quite staying the same. You've also got the enormous hit of Another One Bites the Dust. I'm not even going to say too much about that, because what more can be said? It is such a big song that pretty much everyone likes. My personal favorite from the album, however, is Play the Game. And to my knowledge, I do assume that's a pretty popular song. I'm not really plugged into Queen's Reddit or the Queen fandom in terms of what's pretty much commonly accepted as good, bad, popular, etc. But I would assume, just because it's so good, that Play the Game is a very popular song. And again, subjectively, it's my favorite. Now, regarding the rest of the songs in between, not to be redundant again, but they don't really feel too inspired to me. They don't really feel that fresh. A lot of them kind of sound the same, which is why, even though I do consider it a great album, I don't have it much higher than where it is. Moving on, getting better and better, we have The Works from 1984. And the reason I have this higher than the rest is because, honestly, this is, in my opinion, where they really got it together in the 80s. Yes, they probably realized, okay, we can't make a Night at the Opera anymore. That's not going to fly in this decade of this trends and this style. However, they probably also realized, okay, that doesn't mean we have to make Hot Space. So in my opinion, The Works is honestly a great album. While it does sound of its time, I don't think that means that they sold out to the trends or to the time. In my opinion, this album had some of the best Freddie Mercury vocals of his entire career. Not to say he wasn't capable in the 70s, but I just don't think he would do it as well as he did in this album in 1984. I consider the 70s Freddie's creative prime, and I consider the 80s Freddie's vocal prime. This album had some very iconic Queen songs as well, and honestly, at this point of the rankings, the rest of them are going to